Good evening and welcome to Know Before You Grow, a subcommittee of Petaluma Urban Chat. I'm Dan Lyke, and as always, extreme thanks to Dave Alden and Sharon Kirk and the many other people who come together to make this all work as nicely as it does. A couple of quick announcements before we get to the main meat of things. We have been Zoom bombed before. We will be Zoom bombed again if things get weird. Last time it was somebody drawing swastikas on the screen and playing some weird martial music. I will lock this meeting, boot them, and we'll get back to things as soon as we can. Upcoming events, Wednesday, March 16th. We think we are going to have an introduction to the Spindel developers who are talking about a development at 500 Hopper. There is a possibility that that won't happen. So if you tune in here and we're not around, that's what happened. Wednesday, March 17th. Petaluma General Plan Advisory Committee. Dave, is that that's a city thing? I just copied that off. That's not Know Before You Grow, right?
That's not Know Before You Grow, no.
Okay,
that's
cool.
GPAC.
Yeah, then go do that. Wednesday, March 23rd. We're going to talk about walkability featuring America Walks. Thursday, March 24th at noon at Aquas Cafe, we will have an in-person gathering. For Eris and those others, I'm sorry, we do not have a package for Zoom that enables closed captioning. That requires both paying Zoom a heck of a lot more money.
There's an automatic one in there that does it automatically with just your most basic business account.
Where is that?
You have to have enabled it in your profile before you can enable it in a specific meeting.
Oh, okay, yeah, because the last time I looked at that, unfortunately, it then required an additional add-on package. So if they have changed that, then I'm sorry, I have not done it for this meeting. I will make sure that I go in and poke around and do that for next meeting. Sorry about that. Wednesday, April 13th, Know Before You Grow will be talking with the new Smart General Manager, Eddie Cummins, on the future of shared Petaluma and Smart. And that might happen in person, depending on how we all feel about where COVID is at that point and what we can do about venues. And so stay tuned. And then Wednesday, April 27th, we will go back to talking about the general plan series with missing middle in the Bay housing in the Bay Area with Jane Lynn and Annie Freeman. With that, I am going to turn the mic over to Abigail Smith, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. Abigail, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I am pleased to present Leah, who is all things transportation related. She's been a board member for the Golden Gate Bridge and San Francisco MTA. She was the executive director for the San Francisco Bike Coalition and is the founder and director of the Vision Zero network. She now lives in Sebastopol and was recently referenced in the New York Times twice in 1 week. So for me, that's pretty impressive. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I'm excited to see your presentation.
Thanks, Abigail. Thanks, Dave, Dan, for reaching out. Hi, I'm Leah Shahum with the Vision Zero Network. Thank you. Very nice introduction. And I'm seeing some, I don't want to say some familiar faces on this screen. So really nice to see folks that, I remember working with way back when. So thank you so much for having me. Maybe before I jump into the slides, I just want to share a little bit of, a little more history of, as Abigail mentioned. I live up in Sebastopol now. I just moved here a year and 2 months ago. I'm counting because it has been so great, I have to say. I lived in San Francisco for about 25 years, and that was also great. But this is really great. So I just want to say I love your north neck of the woods. I'm always happy to be having an excuse to go to Petaluma or go through and linger a little bit longer than I probably need to, but I'm really happy to have been invited today. So thank you. Thanks for caring about these issues, which obviously you do, and taking the time to invest in your community, which you obviously do. So thank you. And if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen now. You would think by now I would know how to do this just perfectly, but okay. Is that showing up, folks?
That
Everybody
is
see
showing
that?
up. Awesome.
Super great. So yeah, when y'all invited me, I think it was kind of broadly to hear a little bit about the Vision Zero work happening around the country, a lot happening here in California, and some really new promising things. And let me pause and just say, first of all, a little bit about what Vision Zero is, kind of big picture. Hopefully folks have kind of heard the phrase. The goal is 0 traffic deaths or severe injuries among all road users. That's everybody: driving, walking, biking, riding a scooter, riding a motorcycle, transit, everybody. And I kind of labeled today's presentation "Shifting the Paradigm for Safety." And I think you'll hear a common theme here. As much as we need to help people do the right thing and be safe, we do. There's a lot more we need to be doing upstream, and really thinking about the systems, the design of our streets, which I heard you talking about as at the beginning of the call, but really thinking upstream about how are we creating a truly safe system, a truly safe community. So it really is about a paradigm shift, big time. Yeah, a little more background, or you mentioned in my intro, but here's my bike. I always like to show off my bike. It really is that beautiful orange color. And I really did buy orange tulips that day. So I literally, this was at my old place in San Francisco, in the Mission. I literally had to find somebody to say, this is weird, but will you take my picture? Because I just feel very, very classic, like happy urban bicyclist person. So yes, this is my background. I'll just share a little bit that I really fell into this field. I mean, not literally in a bad way, like no big crash or anything. It was just that I moved from suburban Florida. I grew up in the suburbs, very, very, very suburban Florida. I didn't know anything about transit or the idea of a walkable community or any of these things. But I moved to San Francisco out of college. And I did not bring a car. I had a car back in Florida, but I didn't bring a car because I thought, oh, I'm in a big city. I don't need a car. And it was really hard to get around. This was mid-90s, if folks might remember. It was like huge Muni meltdown, they called it. But transit was a really bad place. So I borrowed a friend's bike, and brand new to the city, borrowed a friend's bike and was biking from the Haight area to downtown to the marina pretty much every day. Like you do when you're 20 something, working 2 jobs, doing a nighttime waitress shift to actually let me live, survive, et cetera, et cetera. And I am biking all over the city. At the time, the hills didn't even bother me, which today they probably would, but it was all fine and good, except that it was really scary. People were really aggressive, and many people out there were not happy about me biking, it seems. So I really fell into advocacy that way. Really, honestly, nothing terrible happened, but I just got shaken up a lot, kind of emotionally biking, and thought, well, this is weird. I feel like I'm doing a good thing here. Why are these people so angry? And then I literally kind of fell into the bike coalition. I kind of love that I was at a coffee shop, and I'm sharing more detail here just because you guys, Bay Area, we're all friends. I was literally at a coffee shop and eavesdropping. I'm so bad, but I was getting a coffee and I was eavesdropping, and I heard people talk about biking and riding and safety and bike lanes and stuff. And I kind of walked over and said, oh, hi, what are you talking about? What are you doing? Next thing I know, after half an hour of chit-chatting with these strangers, I was the editor of the Tubular Times, the newsletter, volunteer editor, obviously, literally, that's how nonprofits work. You guys know all this, you show a little bit of interest, and next thing you know, you're the head of it. You're the head of the committee. So I became a very hardworking volunteer, and then I started working there. And then I ended up being the executive director for about 15 years. And it was, one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done in my life. But switching now, or kind of changing gears, a lot of progress in many places, as we know, building out bike networks, lots more people biking, lots more women biking, lots more families and kids biking. You didn't just have to be hardcore. You could be on this heavy, slow orange bike with your tulips and your groceries and be fine, or not fine, be better, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll tell you, after about 13 or 14 years of doing this job, I was, never grew a thick skin, let me say, to the tragedies that were constantly happening. People dying on the streets, being severely injured on the streets, simply because they were walking somewhere or biking somewhere or driving somewhere, anything. And it really, really was honestly taking a toll. And I heard about the concept of Vision Zero. And I heard about it kind of like, anyone might. I think it was, reading an article or listening to a radio interview. This was pre-podcast. But, I heard the phrase Vision Zero and started reading up on it, and started in Sweden. And I got, really excited thinking, wow, these people are setting this goal of 0 traffic deaths. They're saying that out loud. How bold, how ambitious. And at the same time, in my mind, I'm thinking we could never do that here. I mean, we couldn't even say those words, right? And by that, I mean America in general. And I'm a pretty optimistic person, I'll say, but I was like, wow, yeah, we could never, do that. We're so car focused. We're so this, we're so that, et cetera. Let me say that was about 7 years ago, and I'm very happy to say I was wrong about that. I mean, not that we're anywhere near that, and we'll get there, but I was very wrong about that. A long way of saying we did kick off a campaign as advocates for a Vision Zero program in San Francisco, and we succeeded in getting the mayor on board and the police chief and the transportation chief and et cetera. I want to give credit. New York City was first in the US, I should say. So New York City committed to Vision Zero. And frankly, that did give us more confidence to try it. And San Francisco became the second US city to commit to the goal of Vision Zero. So fast forward, I really love this work, and we were getting tons of calls from other communities. I mean, from Anchorage, Alaska to Durham, North Carolina to Orlando, Florida, very different places calling and saying, oh, what is this Vision Zero? We want to do this. So again, I was really happy I was wrong about American communities not wanting to embrace this. So what motivates this work? And this will be the very, very down part of my presentation. You'll probably know these. Unfortunately, this number is even a little higher, but more than 42,000 people were killed in preventable traffic crashes in this country in 2020, even with the pandemic, with fewer trips. I won't get into all the data and numbers, but a lot of us were shocked when we first heard, well, A, that number is shocking and absolutely unacceptable. But with the pandemic and far fewer trips, we all remember the first year, right? A lot fewer car trips and trips in general. And still in this country, our traffic death numbers went up and our rate skyrocketed. And that was extra disturbing, I will say, for a million reasons. So, every day I think we have more than 42,000 reasons to get up and do the job we're doing to try and make our streets and sidewalks and bikeways safer. And I just want to share a few more stats I think are really important, and I'm imagining, especially for the kind of community-oriented work that you're doing, are important to remember. Traffic deaths are the leading cause of death, any sort of death of youth in this country and globally. That is shocking to me. I honestly did not know that until a few years ago. Shocking. So thinking about this idea of what motivates change, what might get in somebody's head or skin or heart to say, oh, we have to do differently. If this statistic does not jolt someone and make them think differently, I don't know honestly what can. A few more stats that I think we're paying more attention to. They're not new, I should say. They're not new, but we're, I think, as a community or society being a little more aware. But that people in low-income communities are far more likely, 3 times more likely to be killed while walking by people driving than in high-income areas. People of color are also disproportionately impacted. Specifically, Black people are about 80% more likely to be killed by drivers while walking in this country than white non-Hispanic Americans. And the stats go on and on. Native Americans, even higher than that. We all know, probably, obviously, people walking and biking are dying at much higher rates. So these are, and you'll hear me say it again, these are preventable tragedies that are not happening evenly in our community. We generally know where they're happening, to whom, when, how. And more and more, I think we're realizing this. We are getting the results we designed for. Largely the traffic, and I'd really say, public space crisis that we have on our streets and sidewalks and bikeways is largely predictable. We're getting the results we've designed for, whether it's from how we've designated space to literally the vehicles we drive. This is not a made up picture. This is a colleague's 3-year-old standing in front of an actual truck. That driver cannot see that child. That's just impossible. So there are many parts of our systems that I would say are designed for what we're getting. I mean, and I don't mean that intentionally, of course, that sounds very grim, but you know, the 42,000 plus traffic deaths a year should not surprise us, actually, based on how we're designing our systems. All right, that's the very dark part. I'm going to turn back to my my very optimistic half more than glass full part, is that we can make change. So the fact that we know kind of generally where things are happening, with whom, with what kind of vehicles, et cetera, means that we can, again, we can predict them and we can do things to prevent them. So kudos to the more than 45 communities around the country. We would love to welcome Petaluma at some point if you're interested. No pressure. This is not a pitch, but an invitation. More than 45 communities. Hopefully you can see this on the map. And there's more, I just am not keeping up with this map, have committed to the goal of Vision Zero. So what does that mean? It's not, I want to be really clear, Vision Zero is not a tagline. It's not a slogan. It's not even a program. It's not something you fit in. Done right. And let me say, most of these aren't truly, you know, doing it fully yet. I'll be honest about that. We're early stages here, but we're learning. Doing it right is really a paradigm shift. As I said in the beginning, it really is thinking and doing differently. And I'll give some examples of that. But what we're showing here, giving credit, is really when you have your top elected official, and hopefully we have some on the line today, but it really is getting public official commitment from your mayor, from your city council members, your city manager, obviously your transportation chief, and those folks that are really decision makers, policy makers, street designers, et cetera, really getting that commitment. So let me break down just kind of basics, kind of high level. What are the differences? And again, I really want to stress, we are all about depth over breadth. I've never actually like gone out and said, cold, hey, you should be a Vision Zero community. I mean, I did just then, just to invite you guys, but it really has been communities calling us saying, I want to learn more. I want to learn more. There's a ton of interest out there, which is great. And the first thing I say is, you know, you're not going to do it all in one swoop. And again, this is not just a great, you know, kind of snazzy name. It really is about a lot of kind of organizational and inward work and thinking about and doing things differently. So here are the big pieces of it. And I'll just touch on a couple of these a little bit more deeply. Some are pretty straightforward, but that first one you see, you know, the traffic deaths are inevitable, shifting to the idea that traffic deaths are preventable. And I really liken this to, you know, people aren't literally walking around saying, you know, traffic deaths are inevitable. It's not that clear, but we literally have been. If you look at plans, if you look at most states' transportation plans, or et cetera, you know, they'll talk about, oh, we want to reduce traffic deaths by 10%, by 1%, by this. We want to do a little better. And then you pause and say, you know, is this how we handle other important issues? Is this how we think about, say, gun violence? Is this how we think about a pandemic? Is this how we thought about the AIDS crisis at its, you know, height of years? Like with other massive health or safety issues, is our goal to do a little bit better or maybe a little less worse? Like, no, our goal is to help sure everyone is safe. So really it's a mindset shift change about that goal of zero, right? Because when you pause and say, okay, let's do 10% better, you know, or let's have half the number of traffic deaths. You know, like the question we always ask is, okay, who are those other half? Who is this okay for? Is it your family member? Is it your colleague? Is it your neighbor? Of course not, right? So we need to be designing, setting policies with the goal of safety for everyone. So a big difference here, and this is the second one, is a real shift in how we're thinking. And we, again, I'm interested in individuals' behavior, certainly, but I'm much more interested in, let's call it the 1% of folks who have influence over the streets, over the sidewalks, over the speeds, over the car vehicle design, and obviously things like regulations. So traditionally, and again, these words aren't spoken explicitly, but we really have been. And if you look at most kind of PR education campaigns for traffic safety, it's really about trying to perfect human behavior. Hey, you know, and let me say, of course, yes, look both ways before you cross the street. Don't drive drunk. These are important things one should learn, and one should do the right thing. But let's be honest, people are imperfect. Mistakes are inevitable, whether it was by true accident or whether it was, you know, bad choice. People make bad choices, right? So what we need to do as system designers, and again, there's that kind of 1% idea, is is expect that there's going to be some human failure, right? Sometimes people are going to do stupid or bad things or just be careless. How do we then create a system where, yeah, crashes are going to happen? Vision Zero is not about zero crashes. Even I'm not that positive of a person. Crashes will happen. Even in that future world of all automated vehicles, I'm saying that somewhat facetiously, but there will be crashes. If those crashes are fender benders and broken ankles, we can live with that. It's unfortunate, but that is manageable. That happens, right? We can actually design out of our systems the death and the severe injuries. So you'll see a little bit there about the focus. And the second to last one, I'll just lift up. This kind of goes with the other, but the idea of individual responsibility versus the systems approach. Again, those of us working hard for Vision Zero and traffic safety folks, we're not saying there's no individual responsibility. Of course, again, you do want to teach people and you want to ingrain your responsibility, but we've been ignoring the upstream systems. And actually I'm going to jump ahead just because I think this is a little bit more helpful to show. But what you'll see here is something developed by a group called the Prevention Institute. I want to acknowledge them. It's a public health approach, and the words here are used in the public health field all the time. And this is the idea of, okay, you've got a, say, health crisis. These areas on the bottom, in case it's a little hard to read here, but you've got things on the bottom in yellow, like promoting community education, strengthening individual knowledge and skills. We do need to do those. And those are the examples I said. Again, be careful when you're crossing the street, look both ways, don't drive drunk, follow the speed limit. These are important things for people to do. We spent a lot of time doing our finger wagging and education. Let's say there's good education, then there's finger wagging, et cetera. What we haven't spent the time, not just time, but I would say what we haven't committed the political will to is these upstream, the ones in blue. So influencing policy and legislation, changing organizational practices. So examples of that in our world, again, you could use this for, people do use this for all sorts of health, public health issues. We're not going to stay at that low level trying to change every individual's behavior. We're going to do our best there, but we're going to look upstream and say, okay, what are the policies? What are the practices that actually influence everyone? Those are things like, sounds really basic, but making sure we have complete streets, right? If there's not a safe place to walk, you can't educate or enforce that person to be safe while walking. I mean, if they literally do not have a good, say, crosswalk in a place they need a crosswalk. If someone biking has no safe place to bike, again, that's not an individual behavior problem. It is a systems level problem. So we need to create the bikeway there, right? We need to create the design, the system, or maybe it's lower speeds. Again, there's a difference between speeding. Someone shouldn't speed and go higher than the speed limit. And then we have a massive issue with speed set too high. So, me as an individual out there, I don't have any control over how speeds are set, but your city council members do, and your state legislators and your chief traffic engineer do. So really what I'm trying to show is kind of this hierarchy of influence. And I'm going to go back now because I skipped over this, but if there's one thing I like to kind of encourage people to take away from this. So this idea of inevitability, right? We've all, I was raised for, I don't know, 45 years, first 45 years of my life, calling them accidents. And we do, right? Traffic accidents. You see it in the paper, you're going to, hear it all day. Why do we call them accidents, right? It's as if this meteor came out of the sky, out of nowhere. We had no earthly idea this could happen. Well, no, actually you set up a street like this, you have lots of, fast moving vehicles moving around, and, you're probably gonna have something happen at some point. So this idea of accident, even the phrase, the terminology that almost lets us off the hook. And again, I'm less focused on the individual. Yes, they should not cause a crash, but it's more about the system. These are not accidents out of our control. We actually do have agency. These are crashes. So again, if it's one thing I kind of ask people, we're really pushing the concept of crash, not accident. So, next time somebody says accident, you need to be mean about it. But actually, I've recently been thinking about that, and we're using the term crash instead of accident because these things are in our control, et cetera. So it's a learning opportunity next time you're chatting with someone. So back to the idea of kind of who influences where and how, and where do we need to be putting more energy. This concept of a safe system, and obviously it's not just one system, but we call it a system, right? There's lots of pieces of it. It's the way the roads are designed. It's the way the cars are built. It's whether there are options for people walking and biking that are safe. It's how speeds are set, et cetera. So this safe system, right? How do we really encourage safe system to meet the need of safe mobility. Because honestly, the safest thing would we'd all be home, like, you know, in a fetal position, not leaving our houses. And that's not what we want, right? We want mobility, but we want safe mobility. So this is a great, I really like this diagram we borrowed from the Swedes. If you look at the kind of bottom right with the people moving about. So whether you're driving, walking, biking, riding the bus, etc. Yes, you should be responsible. Move over to the next circle next to it. If, I would say when actually, when road users make mistakes, again, maybe they're speeding, something's going to happen at some point, right? People make mistakes. Then you look up to the top circle. And this is really where we need to be putting more attention is how do we really enable and empower and encourage, those are my nice words, our system planners, street designers, our policymakers to actually change designs where we need, change speeds where need, change policies. So really thinking again about if we know this is a problem somewhere, we know this is an issue, let's do it differently. So I'm going to name just two examples of that I've obviously referred to a bunch here. There's a lot of things, but I would say the two most important things we as communities can do. And again, I heard you guys talking a little bit about this at the beginning. So it's, yeah, good to hear. These are not, let me start by saying these are not new concepts. The Vision Zero people didn't come in and say, oh, we have a bunch of tools you've never heard of. It's not that. Well, I think we're doing well. And by we, I mean, community members everywhere, we're lifting up more voices, more public will and political will for the tools that work. Now, why weren't we using those tools? Probably because they're hard politically, let's be honest. So just a little preface, but here's the first one, managing speed for safety. So again, this idea of can we eliminate all crashes? No, don't think so. We'd like to prevent as many as we can, absolutely, but we're going to have some crashes. The biggest factor in those crashes is speed. And obviously that's an even bigger factor when we're talking about someone in a vehicle, say a 2-ton vehicle, and someone not walking or biking. So, or taking a scooter. So, speeds matter no matter what, whether it's car or car pedestrian, but obviously a lot more in that latter. And if there was one graph I would show, my crash not accident would be my one ask of everybody. Help us turn to crash not accident. The one data point I would show is this one on the bottom here. This again is something I did not understand until recently. A person walking, and by the way, this is for kind of an average, I don't know what that is, but an average able-bodied person. This is not, say, a frail senior or a very small child. The numbers would be even more dramatic and terrible. But I'm going to consider myself an average kind of build person. If I'm hit while walking by an average motor vehicle moving at 20 miles per hour, I have a 90% chance of survival. Scary, but okay. At 40 miles per hour, and 40 doesn't seem like that much, right? I mean, people are going 40 in our communities all the time. I have a 10% chance of survival. My odds have swapped. So this is dramatic. And it's kind of like the biggest, to me, the most compelling number. There's a lot more you can look at, but we can manage speed. We can do a lot to manage speed. Number one, I heard you guys talk about traffic calming, designing roads for the speeds we want physically. That's the number one. We really want to design for the speed you want. Don't just expect people to be angels. They're not going to be, right? They're going to take mistakes every now and then. So how are we designing for the speeds we want? So narrowing lanes, more curves where we can, traffic circles, etc. There's a lot of good things one can do. Setting lower speeds. And I'm going to give some examples of that, but we're seeing a real boom. This concept of 20 is plenty. Maybe it's 25 in places, maybe it's 20 in places. We love the 20 even more, but maybe on a bigger arterial, it's 25, on a smaller neighborhood street, it's 20, but lowering speed limits, not just on its own, you're going to want design changes as well where you can, but lowering speed limits does make a difference. And most importantly, it tells people, hey, this is the safe speed. Doesn't mean no one's going to go above it. I get that. But if you're setting the speed at 30, they're going to be going 35, 40. If you're setting the speed at 20, you're going to bring down some of those high end speeders. And then I'll mention automated speed enforcement. Not everyone's favorite topic, but we are fans. We think they can be done well where the cameras are really, again, these are speed cameras, where they are compelling better behavior. The goal is not more tickets, but changing behavior. So come back to a couple examples in a second on that. So that's number one, managing speed for safety. And then number two, you guys all know this, but it's really about designing. And these two things are related, of course, but designing complete streets, designing slower streets. And honestly, I think a big piece of this is mental for me, of not being afraid to talk about slowing people down, right? That kind of has a notoriously negative connotation. But I think more and more as our fast-paced lives, like, it's okay to slow down. You know what? It's actually really good to slow down on the road because chances of killing someone are far fewer. But just this concept of like, let's embrace a little bit slower. So I'm showing these pictures not because they're good, if you didn't pick that up yet. I'm going to pick on my hometown of Jacksonville, Florida. They're both from Jacksonville, Florida. And I always feel bad when I'm in Jacksonville or anywhere in Florida showing these, but this really is what most of Florida looks like. On the top left, you'll see it's right outside my parents' house. It's a very typical suburban area. These 4 or 5, I think 5 kids are walking to school. I took this photo. They're walking. It's great. They're in middle school. There's a middle school like 2 or 3 blocks away. So isn't that great? Children getting fresh air and exercise. Hooray. They do not have a sidewalk. There's not one on the other side either. And I know this looks like a small road, but people driving go tearing down. So just a idea of like, hey, can we educate these kids to do the right thing? Should this be enforced? Of course not, right? They do not have a good option. So who can fix it? Is it the kid? No, it's the street designer. So really thinking about how are we, I would say demanding, enabling, empowering that kids have safe places to walk, really basic concept. And then, I think the picture on the bottom speaks for itself. Not a good choice or not a good option, but what choice does this guy have about where to ride? This is just a couple examples, but I think I saw that you guys had done this, which is great, but I don't want to, maybe we can talk about it during the discussion. But one of the most important things we encourage any community to do is really do an analysis of where their biggest problems are. Again, this stuff is not, it's not accidental. It's not like, oh, no idea. We have no idea. There are trends, right? It's usually your high-speed streets. It's usually places where you do have a lot of interaction, of course, with people walking, biking, and driving. That makes sense, right? It's where you have the activity and more likelihood of crashes. But what we're seeing in city after city, they're basically doing, I would say, deeper analysis. And it doesn't take a lot, but a little more analysis of high injury networks. So not just where are all crashes, because again, the fender benders, I'm not saying they're not important, but we can live with it. Where are your severe injuries and fatalities? And time again, what we see is a massive concentration on a small number of streets. So San Francisco, for instance, this is not just crashes. I should have written that better. 70% of severe injuries and fatality crashes are on 12% of streets. Denver, 50% of the fatalities are on 5% of the streets. You get the idea. So knowledge is power, right? And why aren't we fixing those streets? Probably because they're hard ones to fix. Let's be honest. It's not like we don't care, but they're usually streets that are going to be tough to change. And that's really what this is about, is being willing to make change. I'm not going to take too long on this, but I do want to give credit, and I'll share a little bit more, that the national level, this is not just some kooky, like, ooh, West Coast, San Francisco and Portland and New York idea. The very, very, how shall I say, mainstream and staid U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration embraces this safe system approach. And this is really new. This has really come about, honestly, in the last 2 years. It's really exciting. You can see some same things I've just talked about, like humans make mistakes, humans are vulnerable, death is unacceptable. We're now seeing, our federal agencies use this language. So this is not a crazy far out idea. Now, let me say, are they doing all the things they need to do in line with the language? Not yet. Not yet. We have a lot more to do, but this is a step. And kind of coming back, I just wanted to highlight, actually, I probably doubled this one, but we have online, or I'm happy to share maybe after this meeting, and we can share what we call Vision Zero core elements, 10 of them. And, one of them is managing speed for safety, but this concept of, gosh, we don't know what to do. These things are so random and out of our control. In fact, they're not. Again, we have these kind of core elements, and some of them are more on the, technical side, things that your planners and engineers and policymakers need to do. And part of them, and some of them are on kind of a regulation side, vehicle design side. This is a little graphic we made. Please don't hold us to these numbers. And by that, I mean, these are estimates from wonderful people's different studies, everybody from, AAA to Consumer Reports to the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. What we did is go out there and look and say, okay, I want to emphasize this, with existing tools, things that exist today, not 5 years down the road, not 20 years down the road when, machines can do everything, but with things we have today, if all these things were implemented, if all these things were in place in this country, the estimate is prevent 75% of the deaths, so 31,000 lives. So things like, I need to read them quickly, but alcohol detection systems. And again, this is an example of a safe system approach where, should we tell people not to drive drunk? Yes, we should. And we should have laws against it and all these important things. But it's still happening, unfortunately. But we also could have what are called alcohol interlock systems in all cars, or maybe it's cars of people who are repeat offenders of drunk driving, et cetera, but where they cannot turn the car on until they breathe into something and it recognizes whether they're drunk or not. I'm not an expert in this, but these things exist. And people who know this stuff are like, yeah, if we did that today, it would save 9,000 lives a year is the estimate. So this is, again, it's a bunch of numbers put together, but the point being, we know how to do these things. Oh, and I did put that in again. So I want to just give a couple examples of progress, and then I'm going to stop talking because I'm more excited to hear about how things are going in Petaluma, ideas, suggestions, hopes and dreams. I mentioned New York City before, and I want to give them credit because they were the first US city to commit to Vision Zero. And you'll see those green lines, their traffic deaths, they improved considerably on safety. Sadly, they're back up to about 2014 levels. They've gone back up during the pandemic the last 2 years also, like many cities have. It's terrible and confusing, but also not totally confusing. But I do want to say that the kinds of things that New York did to make this a significant change and to make people safer, help people be safer, they lowered speed limits. They added cameras, speed cameras around schools. They redesigned a lot more streets than they used to. They sped up, I should say, their design. So just a couple examples of, they lowered their citywide, their de facto speed limit before Vision Zero was 30 miles per hour. They lowered it to 25. They actually were pushing for 20, got it at 25. Huge deal, huge deal. Now, does that mean everyone's going the speed limit? Of course not. It's not that. But overall, speeds have dropped, and those high-end speeders, there's not as many high-end speeders, which of course are the most dangerous. And this is just an example I really like of their design piece. I'm not sure folks can read, but Queens Boulevard, it was called the Boulevard of Death. You can kind of see on the before side, the left, really wide. I want to say it was like 7 lanes, like 7 travel car lanes. And it actually went through areas with like people live there and stores and not a super busy commercial area, but there were people that needed to walk and bike and such. And they were having just a huge number of deaths. You see here, 300 plus crashes a year. And then what they did is a massive redesign. Again, this is part of their Vision Zero program. Is anything they did on this design, you'll see they added bike lanes, colored bike lanes with a physical buffer, that little white thing, but not a lot, but it's a physical buffer. They added much better crosswalks. They retimed the lights. Can't see it all there, but they actually reduced the number of travel lanes. So they did a lot. And you'll see the pedestrian injuries went down 49%, bike injuries 42%, overall injury crashes down 4%. They also lowered speed limits. I should mention that. Was anything they did, were any of those changes or tools, were they not available before Vision Zero? Or is it some new concept? No, it wasn't. It really was about political will. Even though people, just huge numbers were dying and getting injured over time on Queens Boulevard, there was this resistance to change. People do not generally want to change something. That's kind of our deal, right? Especially if there's a perception, it's going to take me 2 minutes longer to get to work or something. So this really is about how honestly are we using, I hate to say using, but leveraging the tragedies on our streets that have happened to say this can't keep happening. We need change. And that's really when you talk to the folks in New York and many places, how did they win the speed cameras? And they had to get state legislation for that. How did they win the lowering speed limits to 25? How did they win the redesign of this and a bunch of other streets? It's really because they really did bring that data in, those horrific numbers, and really leveraged it with, frankly, experiences and stories. I don't want to say this is all about data. Data is super important, but it really is about, folks who've been impacted. Sadly, we work with I say wonderful, but an important group called Families for Safe Streets. And these are individuals around the country who've been either injured themselves in crashes or lost, more often lost loved ones. So these are moms and dads and kids who've lost parents and children, and it's just horrific. Sadly, these are the people who can get attention of your policymakers and your designers. And I, by the way, I don't mean, you know, if someone's not comfortable doing that, of course not, but there are folks out there who have gone through these tragedies and don't want it to happen to other families. And you know, we're very thankful for them for stepping up and being part of this advocacy. So part of what New York did too, it's kind of a boring picture, I know, but I think it's really important that part of what the safe system approach is not just reacting. I know I've talked a lot about, you know where your injuries are and then go do something there, right? Yes, it is that, but it's also, it's seeing the trends. It's being more proactive and predictive. And I just want to say for all the engineers on the call, you know, we love that engineers know how to, want to, and know how to fix problems, right? It's like, okay, here's a problem. We need to fix it. So this idea with the safe system proactive approach is, hey, let's not wait till there's a death somewhere and then we go back and fix the problem. Let's look and see what are the trends or what are the you know, patterns, I guess patterns. And here's an example where in New York City, and we have this study online if you want to know more, you know, big city, they did this analysis to say, okay, traffic deaths, where are they happening? And injuries, serious injuries, where are they happening? What's happening? And they saw a predominance or a, you know, high number of situations where a driver was making a left on a multi-lane to multi-lane street. And there was a heavy number, a lot of pedestrians crossing. That makes sense, right? The left turn, being able to look and see. So it wasn't rocket science, but they looked and said, oh, okay, this is a very common thing, more than these other things. So what they're doing, and I think this is so important, and this is the kind of leadership we need, frankly, we're not just gonna go fix those, I'm making the number up, 7 locations where someone was killed with this maneuver. We're gonna go fix the 300 intersections that have this design. We're gonna proactively design them differently. And it's different. Like you'll see here, this is not the most beautiful example, but they tightened this radius of the turning. They put these yellow posts up and the paint so that the driver has to kind of go wider and they have to slow down and there's more time and visibility for the pedestrian crossing. At other places where the left turn wasn't, you know, could be an issue. Again, they didn't wait till someone was an issue. Other places, the design was different. They might have prohibited the left turn because there was no way to do it well. They might have changed the light timing. They might have done a different design, all sorts of different things. I mean, not a million things, but they had different tools for different things. But the point being, and I'll say this, you know, a community like Petaluma or Sebastopol, we could certainly do this, right? You think in New York and the hundreds and hundreds of miles of roads, right? We could do this systematically and really look and say, okay, what are our problem? What types of situations are problem points and how do we fix them? I want to give credit to San Francisco, San Jose, and other communities in California. We've been working really hard to try and get speed limits or get a state law passed that would help locals have more flexibility on lowering speed limits. That passed just this past fall. It's really exciting. I don't want to get all wonky with how it works, but if anybody's interested, give me a ring. There's still some things to work out, but it basically means if you have problems on your street, by that I mean dangers, and you want to lower your speed limits, you're going to have more flexibility to do it. It's not 100% flexibility, but more flexibility. It's crazy that the state was basically tying locals' hands about speed. And it's happening in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco. If folks, you know, it's a very dense area, a lot of high-speed arterials going through the Tenderloin. It's also the lowest car ownership, highest walking and transit and children density, and a lot of people speeding, frankly. So they've lowered, I don't know if it's all the streets, a lot of streets in the Tenderloin to 20 miles per hour. Too soon to say what effect that's having. I think it's just been a few months, but they're measuring that, which is exciting. And I want to give a shout out to one other Bay Area community, just to share, like, hey, it's not just your like dense city, Fremont, you know, a little bit more, I'd say suburban in style, right? They committed to Vision Zero around 2015, and they've consistently, and interestingly, through the pandemic too, 21 and 22, well, 21, I can't say 22, 21, their traffic deaths remained lower than pre-Vision Zero. And when you talk to them, a lot of what they did was they did more road diets. They did more street design for complete streets. They did lower some speed limits where they could. They did a lot around schools, They had a lot of they were having a lot of senior injury and deaths. So they did a lot around senior centers. They were really focused on kind of the areas that needed the improvements. I won't go through all this, but kind of an example, a few other examples just around the country. Places like Charlotte, North Carolina, lowering speed limits. Portland, Oregon is doing a 20 is plenty and lowering all their residential streets to 20 miles per hour. Macon, Georgia, I like this example just because it's not the usual suspects, right? It's a small town, very small town in the South, and they've embraced Vision Zero. Denver, Colorado, and I'll just mention, one of the things you really want to do is make sure this is, again, these are not just words. This is not just a tagline. It's not a program. It's not even just a plan, right? It really has to be integrated and tracked. And I think Denver, to me, Denver has one of the best action plans. If you want to look at a Vision Zero action plan, I would check theirs out. They do a really good job of integrating things like equity in there and speed. And then they really track them well. This image of the tracking is online. So you can publicly go in and see, okay, the city said they would fix, 20 intersections. They've done 15 so far. So it's really, the transparency is wonderful and it's all around safety. Again, just an example. They also put time. I think it's really important. We're not just saying one day, we're saying this is near term, medium term, long term, who's doing it, right? People deserve, we as members of the community deserve to have this transparency and to have accountability of electeds. So I'm going to wind down just by saying, a lot of times that the first discussion point or question, not surprisingly, is, yeah, but is zero really possible? I get it. It's a very ambitious, audacious, as one would say, goal. Again, I would say, what's the right goal morally? To me, obviously zero is the only goal morally, but the reality is places that have set the goal and made the big shifts are getting there. Again, these are other countries, obviously I wish I could point to a US example, but Oslo, Helsinki, massive changes where they really are, yes, there's still folks driving, of course, there's need to be using a car, but they've really, really prioritized walking, biking, and safe car travel. So yeah, I'm going to wind down just by kind of opening it up. Well, actually, sorry, one more. I realized I threw this in at the end because this is so new. The end of January, if folks have not heard, this is really exciting. I preluded this earlier, but we now have in this country a national zero traffic death goal. This is a quote from our Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, who on this day, January 27th, and we have his whole speech online if you want to see it. We're not going to let him forget a word of that, that the nation is committing to the goal of zero traffic deaths. And he really talks about a lot of these same concepts in that speech and other things that have come out to say, hey, yeah, we need to be, encouraging people to be safe and focusing on, or, including individuals. But what he's saying, we as government, as private entities, as agencies that do control really the systems, we need to do better. And he really talks a lot about that safe system approach. Here's where I will end. I always like this one because it's a little peppier. A lot of talk about sad things like injuries and deaths here, but what should motivate us around the goal is that Vision Zero is about more, right? It's about helping families, friends, loved ones have more birthdays, have more celebrations, and literally having more life. So a reminder of what it's all about. And this really will be the last one. Here's my contact information and happy to chat more with anybody who's interested. I'm going to stop sharing and then, turn it back to you guys. Sorry, that was longer than I thought and hopefully not overly chatty, but I'd love to hear people's reactions, thoughts, skepticism, optimism.
That was wonderful. And I'm excited. And I have a number of questions that I have been collecting from the chat, both asked generally and that have been kind of funneled into me as we went. The first was that Eris Weaver of the Sonoma County Bicycle Coalition asked, have you had any contact with the Sonoma County Vision Zero project? I didn't know you lived here in Sonoma County, and it seems weird that the organizers wouldn't have utilized your expertise.
Thank you. And Eris, I should follow up with you, but yes, I've had a couple of conversations with them that seemed really good to me. I will happily, get your insight on that and see if I can help locally a little bit more, but I was happy to talk with them and know a little bit about what they're doing.
Cool.
But I'll follow up.
Yeah, and if we have time here and end up just kind of opening this up for a free for all rather than kind of keeping it tied down, we'll probably have you guys talk directly. I'll save that one for a little bit later. One of the things I noticed about, or one of the arguments about complete streets, rather than saying doing WUNFs or 15-mile-an-hour things, is that you end up with these, 100-foot wide monstrosities. Could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the different strategies for complete streets versus 15-mile-an-hour WUNFs? And a few weeks ago, we had Chuck Marone of Strong Towns on, and he has
Right.
the notion of stroads and roads and streets. Any thoughts on tying those together?
Yeah, well, he is much more knowledgeable than me on that, as are many people on this call. I see folks that have been planners and engineers and doing this work for a long time. So let me start by saying I'm not a planner or engineer. I'm just a rabble rouser. But to that point, I mean, I think it's really about, okay, what are different tools and what's the best use for them in different places, right? You're not going to have a WUNR for 15 mile per hour and curvy and traffic circle on a major arterial that's 6 lanes wide and connecting to 101, right? That's not the design that idea of a super traffic calmed, really calm, lovely street, like we saw in a couple of those pictures. That's going to be on your more residential streets. And I would say hopefully some commercial streets too. I think about Petaluma's entire downtown, I would say, right? Like the core downtown historic part, versus what are we going to do on those bigger arterials? That is really where it gets tough. It's, let's be honest, it's those bigger arterials. And I don't want to say there aren't answers. I think there are, but there's not as much developed. I think it's something that we've really, as a industry, I don't know, as a profession, not done enough good work on. Like, what do you do about that 6-lane road, right? Usually the big challenge is, let's be honest, and let me say, most of this stuff, it's less technical or practical of a challenge. There's pieces of that. It really is mostly political. It really is. And political, I mean, the idea of change, right? So is the public willing to accept a street, a design, a community, a situation that is perceived to be not ideal in some ways, right? Now, so, you could stop and go, well, God, this will save lives. That seems really positive. Yes, absolutely. Now, when the rubber hits the road at that community meeting, at your city hall meeting, suddenly, wait a minute, you didn't tell me I was going to have to make another right. I used to go straight here, right? I'm giving one example, but it really does come down to that, right? And that devil in the details is really a devil. So I don't have good, I would love if other people do point to here's what you can do that's great on an arterial. A lot of it comes down to slowing those cars down and being honest about, what, you can still drive here, but you can't, it's not going to be a 45 mile per hour street. We're going to do some things, even things like light timing, signal light timing, right? People are going to stop more often. I mean, I'm not saying that's a perfect thing, but there are ways to control things. And I think it's more about kind of the political will to make the change. I mean, it's interesting, the idea of stroads for people who are in on that, it's not, if we had this perfect, and it wouldn't be perfect, but if we had this world where it was okay, everywhere people need to walk and bike have these nicely designed mellow streets, which are wonderful for walking and biking. Well, it's not true, right? We have commercial corridors that also are busy streets. What do you do there, right? You don't want to tell the businesses, oh no one can drive to your business. Of course not, right? That's not going to be fair. But what do we do in those areas? And it may be that it's going to, in some ways, congestion is our friend from a safety standpoint. And maybe we need to get a little more comfortable with that.
I was going to note that one of the theories about the rise in deaths over the pandemic is that less congestion means more deaths.
We had free flowing traffic, right? And which in many engineering terms is a good thing. You want free flowing traffic. Do we? I mean, I don't know if we do always in certain areas. Again, we're not talking about a highway. We're not talking about, the middle of the state where there's, no other obstacles of, not obstacles, I shouldn't say that, people walking and biking, but, in our community, you do have a pecking order, and I would say we should be prioritizing safety over speed, period.
I would like to take a quick break here to recognize several city officials, and we have with us Petaluma's Police Chief, Ken Savano,
Right.
Public Works Director, Bolt, Assistant Director, Benedetti Petnick, Traffic Engineer, Ken Eichstaedt, and City Council members, Delinda Fisher and Kevin McDonald on the call. And the presence of Ken Savano made me think about, I'm a big fan of not trying to use enforcement heavily, but in designing so that drivers aren't tempted to drive faster or physically can't drive faster. Because I think that one of the things that makes us feel uncomfortable about the police is that we get ticked off because they pulled us over for speeding and we were just doing what everybody else is doing. Any thoughts about, and I noticed you mentioned automated enforcement too in there. Any thoughts or experiences in how lowering the speed limits without changing the infrastructure changes behaviors versus just the behavior, or changing the infrastructure and not worrying about the speed limits?
Yeah, I'm super glad you brought that up. Thank you, Dan. I'm really glad that the chief is on. Thank you. And I'd love to hear others' thoughts and yours on this. You know, and I didn't mention this, but I should have. This concept of self-enforcing roads. It almost sounds too good to be true, but it is a thing, right? I mean, if you build it, they will come model, right? If we built a road that's 8 lanes wide and really, really wide and posted it at 65, you're going to get behavior that fits that road. You can't really blame people, like that's the behavior, right? So how are we literally designing for lower speed and setting the speed appropriately? When we do that, I think Seattle's a really good example. They've done some really good work around this. And I'm happy to share some good studies from the last couple of years before and after, that ideally all these things are together and you don't need the enforcement, right? It's, from the law enforcement folks I've talked to over the years, people don't love doing traffic stops. That is not like probably the funnest part of your job, right? People don't want to be, it's not great. And what we're seeing, and this kind of ties back to cameras, and we've certainly seen some good examples in the US. New York City has the biggest speed camera program by far of any US city. But in Europe or other places, I'll just point to Europe, where they've been using them longer. What they're seeing is the speed cameras in particular change behavior. People know where to expect. They're not hidden. It's not a surprise. People don't love that either, understandably. It's really clear, and not just clear, it's predictable and quite common. Now that took years to get there. It wasn't overnight. Obviously, again, not popular to be getting tickets, but what they saw was at the beginning, yes, there were tons of tickets, lots of tickets, people were speeding. And then people's behavior changed. Like they didn't want to get the ticket. And so it's almost this ubiquitous program where now the program, I'm thinking of one in Sweden, barely makes enough money to like cover its own. It's not a moneymaker, and it shouldn't be a moneymaker, right? That's not why we should be doing any of this, of course. So really thinking about, honestly, where law enforcement's time is best spent. And then of course, thinking about, we as a country concerned about issues of, a lot of data and experience around, racialized traffic stops and concerns about, a pattern of that. So thinking are cameras a panacea? Like, or do you just throw them out everywhere? No, absolutely not. They've been done very badly in a lot of places. Thank you very much, Chicago. I feel like Chicago often does something and ends up, oh, you guys, you ruined it for all of us. No, okay. But places where it has been a moneymaker, that's not good, right? And all of a sudden now it's like, oh, we have to have these cameras because we need to pay for something else. That does not build trust and confidence. There's also the issue, and I say this because I think we are dealing with it right now in California. Where you put the cameras matters, of course, right? And one could say, oh, well, couldn't a camera be quote unquote colorblind to kind of who's driving the car? And you could say, well, yeah, okay, that could be a positive. But what we see and what is happening, I don't know if I showed this or not. I apologize that I didn't include a graph of this, but when I showed those images of the high injury networks, again, we can see, okay, in San Francisco, it's mostly here and here and here. They're clumped in areas. That overlaps significantly with low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. And why is that? It's not because certain people are, tending to drive faster just by their nature. Again, it's not an individual behavior. Like, it's because certain neighborhoods, and I'll point to the Tenderloin in San Francisco, they've been built a certain way, right? So there's a community of color and a low-income community that has lots of big arterials, and I would call them speedways through. So yeah, people are speeding there more. It's what the environment honestly almost calls for, sadly. Now you go up to the hills, the fancy like west side of town with all the hills, and you have these beautiful little curvy streets, and people are not speeding, and we don't really need cameras there. Now that's going to be like a vicious cycle, right? So that is something we're dealing with. And I'll mention in California, for folks that might have followed it, there was a legislation proposed last year that did not make it out of the state legislature around cameras that would allow California. I should have said this. We're not allowed to use speed cameras in California. They're prohibited expressly. Some states, they don't say anything, you could use them or not use them, but in California, they're expressly prohibited, which is interesting. So this legislation didn't pass last year. It's been reintroduced by a different assembly member, a Southern California woman named Laura Friedman. She's actually the chairperson of the Transportation Committee, which is, I think, interesting and might have a different path. I'll say we're really interested in supporting it, but there are a lot of concerns about that equity component that I just shared, right? How does this not become another inadvertent, but another tool that is, punishing people for driving while Black? So it's a really big question. I think, good-hearted, smart people are trying to work on it, but it's not a done deal. I'd love to hear, again, if people have experiences or thoughts or want to get involved on that, let me know.
I also noted that in the chat, we had a couple of people toss in, both in the public chat and then directly to me, comments about gathering data. I noticed that know that when Sonoma County published their Vision Zero data dashboard, a number of my biking advocacy friends were like, well, that doesn't capture half of the stuff that I know about.
Yeah.
And there were similar challenges with anecdote versus what we have data collection for, which obviously is sketch in presentations to the city council meeting. And one of the big problems is that if we concentrate on the places where pedestrians are getting hit, we're not always looking at the places where pedestrians aren't, because they look at that place and say, there's no way in hell I'd go through that intersection. Mm-hmm. Yeah, talk a little bit about how Vision Zero meshes to maybe increased pedestrian and bicycle mobility, because sometimes those things might be at odds.
Yeah, Dan, I'm super glad you brought that up. There is an emphasis on data in Vision Zero, right? So, okay, follow the data. What are we seeing? What are the trends, right? The data is power. And at the same time, we know there are always gaps in data. Like, you never have perfect data, but especially around this, for instance, we know, and there's been national studies about this, San Francisco recently did one, back to the equity issue, communities of color and low-income communities are underrepresented in the like official data. Immigrants or folks who are not naturalized citizens, say, who are not necessarily comfortable, sharing an incident, say, with the police for immigration reasons. There are a lot of factors there. Injuries to people walking and biking are underreported for a lot of reasons. So first, that data to begin with is not complete, right? We're never going to have perfect. We can improve it. We should improve it, but that's not perfect. One thing that San Francisco is doing, I think, is really interesting, is working more with the health department. And I don't know if there's any health department folks on here, but really thinking about, this is not it's a transportation issue, but it's not just a transportation problem, right? It's a public health, public safety problem. So I've been really happy to work more with public health people and learned a lot from them, because they're particularly really good at kind of the intersectionality issues, right? In the transportation world, we're like, okay, let's fix this transportation problem. And the health folks can come in and say, hey, let's layer these maps on where we have a high injury network. Wow, look at this. We also have high asthma rates. We also have low car ownership. We also have less economic mobility. We also have higher transit dependency. We also have a food desert, and look and be like, well, okay, people need to get to a grocery store. And, now maybe we should prioritize safe walking or transit to a grocery store, right? So thinking, how does the transportation piece, it's a means to an end, right? Transportation isn't a thing, it's a means to do other things, right? So I would say really pulling your public health folks. But back to that data, yes. Data doesn't tell the whole story. I think people are doing cities are starting to do a better job of recognizing those anecdotes, that's experience, right? And that really does help fill holes in data. So that idea of going out and having community meetings or events like this and people putting on a map, plugging in a map, or maybe it's an app or whatever to say, where do you feel unsafe? Maybe there are not actually a lot of injuries at this location, but you feel so unsafe there or so endangered that you'd avoid it. Maybe you avoid it because of dark, it's too dark and I don't feel comfortable walking there by myself. Well, let's hear about that, right? Because that's an issue too. That's, it's a little bit harder. It's like this art and science piece, but I think it's really important, especially again, in those communities that have been traditionally underserved, that are less likely to go. Let's be honest, they're not maybe so likely to go to a city hall meeting on a Tuesday. They might be working 3 jobs and have trouble with childcare issues, or, how are we hearing their voices? We've got to go to them. And there's been a lot of really good kind of Vision Zero outreach where it's like, hey, they're going to that community event, or they're going to that church service, or that these other things that are happening in that community, and asking them there, not asking them to come to a meeting down at City Hall kind of thing.
Yeah, obviously we are a group of people who are very interested in civic participation.
Yeah.
And one of the examples we've used a couple of times is, if we have to ask somebody to choose between their kids' softball or baseball game and going to a city council meeting, do we really want to tell them that they need to go to the city council meeting? So yes, dealing with that is, so it's been suggested that we kind of raise hands and ask people to pipe in with, try to keep your questions to 25 words if you can. Obviously I can't. And as the form of a question if you can. But a few other things before we get there, and I'll wait for the hands to go up. You mentioned that the recent legislation, which is doing away or allowing modifications of the whole 85th percentile thing on speed. Can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
About the 85th percentile?
Well, or specifically, I suspect most people know what it is, but I don't know the details of that legislation, for instance.
Gotcha. It is so wonky. Honestly, I bore myself talking about it. So I'm not gonna say too much about like the technical stuff, just because it is so darn boring. And like I'd say the big picture, and maybe to say kind of here's what relevant, that idea of in California, for instance, there is a prohibition against using automated speed enforcement. Like I said, there also has been traditionally a lot of not much flexibility in setting speeds. That's a way to say it. Where each state does it differently, but there's some general kind of federal guidance. It's not a requirement, but it's guidance. California has read that guidance very strictly, and I would call it conservatively, and really basically there's this idea where it sounds oversimple, but it's kind of true, is traditionally what's been done is like, oh, we want to lower or raise the speed limit. How do you do that? How do you get approval to do that on a street? You've got to go out and you measure, or you count, basically, or they track how fast are people going now. Now set the speed at the 85th percentile of that. And I'm dumbing it down, and Ken and probably other engineers are like, well, it's not that simple. But that's kind of the big picture idea, is that it's just like tail wagging the dog, or what I say, wag. Ken, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, you're right on.
I can jump in if that's okay, Dan, just real quick.
Please.
85th percentile drives me nuts. And it's basically what it's saying is that at a certain speed, 85% of the vehicles are traveling at that speed or less. But what that means is there's 15% traveling more. And so the example that I'll give is on Bassett Street. Sure, the 85th percentile is 26 miles an hour, and we counted for a week 3,000 cars, but 10% of those cars, Ken Savano's crew, Chief Ken Savano, could go give a ticket to. The frightening thing is, on this roadway, you know, it's roughly 40 feet in width. We've got speeds of over 60 miles an hour on a local neighborhood street. And so that graph that Leah presented is right on with, you know, 40 miles an hour, you know, you've got a 10% chance of living. 60, not really. And it's right next to a park. It's got a school nearby. So 85th percentile came about in the 60s on rural roads. And we're taking that and trying to apply it into dense urban areas. It just does not work. And we really need to find some other ways of looking at it. So thank you. Then thank you very much, Leah. It's really good to see you back here. So
And
it's been a long trip.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys are in good hands, Kenneth.
Yeah, we also have the confusion of the Kens here. Sorry about that. So if we were trying to collect metrics and say, where do we start? How do we put how many intersections do we need to narrow? How do we measure which intersections we need to narrow? Do you have resources for where we'd go about, like, not just where do we start unraveling the knot, but where do we build metrics for how we're accomplishing things? Because obviously deaths are, and even vehicle pedestrian collisions are rare enough that they're not really a statistically significant way to measure progress here. So do you have better ways to measure? How do we start measuring?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because it's, we're not waiting until like, oh, let's, those numbers of traffic deaths. Yeah, that is our ultimate goal, to get to zero, but there's a lot to measure and change to get there. Obviously, it's how to get there. I think, you're talking about the speed piece. I think one of the biggest things is actual speeds. How fast are people driving, and where that's a problem. Some places, I'm not saying it's not a problem, but again, out on a big highway, it's a problem, but it's less maybe severe of a problem, again, where you not right next to a park or a school or people walking. So, where are you measuring unsafe speeds, and what can you do about them? I think you could do a heat map of, so to speak, where are those high speeds, and then layer on top of that, where do we then have, more vulnerable road users? Again, if you're going to have people walking to a park, walking to a bus stop, walking to a commercial area, those should be a higher priority. And I think part of this idea with the data, be more data driven. Sure, data, you need to know what's happening to fix it, so to speak. It helps move beyond the squeaky wheel syndrome. And I'll say there's a positive of a squeaky wheel. I've been a squeaky wheel before, and it, you want to do it. But again, back to this kind of equity component, your squeaky wheels are usually folks with, frankly, more resources and comfort in that kind of political zone. So what we see when we layer a lot of this data is, you might have a lot more problems in areas that are not going to be the squeaky wheel for different reasons. And, their areas deserve to be safe too. So I think, measuring the speed, measuring, again, back to that idea of where do people feel safe or not. So not just your heat map of collisions and severe things, but, and I'll say, I think the police are such important partners on this behavior side too. What I mean by that is, some cities we're working with are doing something which I think is cool. After every traffic death, sadly, a little team from the city will go out to the scene, not like that exact moment, but the police are dealing with it then, but they'll go out within a few days, like very quickly. And they'll go out and it'll be, a planner or engineer from the team, a police officer from the team who hopefully knows the area, someone from, say, the city council member's office where it happened, usually someone kind of more with like a health or that integrated lens will go out and look at it. And the engineer might notice one thing, like, oh, the angle here is really, it's an angle that could be tightened up so that it slows the person down, or somebody else might notice the visibility. Look at these trees hanging. You really can't see in the crosswalk. Or you know what, maybe we remove this parking space, and we call that daylighting, where this parking, and as cars are getting bigger, they're blocking visibility to see someone walking or even another driver, et cetera, at the intersection. And then you might have somebody else look and go, oh, look, I don't know, here's a busy, liquor store, or bar. not to put that on that, but like, hey, maybe you're going to have a lot of people coming out here late at night, and wow, the lighting isn't good. Like, you know, what do you, it's not like, can people go to a bar? Sure, they can. Absolutely. And can they walk out of the bar? Absolutely. You know, do we want them to be safe? Absolutely. But are the conditions, and again, could we do a brighter crosswalk? Could we do brighter lights? If it's a real problem, could there be, you know, more signs up saying, you know, don't forget, you know, take a lift home if you need to. You know, there's all these different components that are not just data, right? It's really about the environment. And I would say bringing different people into that conversation can be really powerful.
Cool. I'm getting pushed to note that we're already 15 minutes over, and we have taken quite a bit of your time. And I wanted to dive also into your slide about vehicle enforcement of driver behavior and all sorts of things like that, because I have a little bit of a employment history in working on stuff to do that with commercial fleets. But just to make sure that people don't feel like they're well, to honor your time and make sure that people don't feel like they're tied around until we give up at midnight, can you end us on like, what's the one thing that if people run out of here and do one thing, if to help Petaluma embrace Vision Zero, what's that one thing? What's the call to action here?
Great question. Really good question. Well, I already told you my small one was that crash not accident. I won't use that, but I want to remind you of the crash not accident terminology. I would say this, think about, and you all are obviously very committed and connected folks in your community. Think about someone you consider influential in this space. Maybe it's a planner, an engineer, a health official, a city council member, even more a city council member staff, right? They're the ones doing lots of work out there. Think a business leader who's prominent or involved. Maybe it's media, some media source. Think about one influencer and maybe have a conversation with them about this concept of crash not accident, and maybe show this some examples. You can steal anything from our website. I think this is it's a huge learning opportunity. Like, this concept is very new to us in the US. And we are like rugged individualism in many ways, which is great in many ways. But when it comes to traffic safety, it's not working so well. We really want to have more of a, I would call it, communal attitude here. So think about, honestly, one person you can have a conversation with. Maybe it's sending them an email with a link to some information. Maybe it's having coffee. Maybe it's walking down a street and saying, could we slow this street down? What do you think? And trying to maybe kind of grow this tent of people that are willing to think differently and make change. And I'll just say thank you all. It's really inspiring, to live in a community, near a community, in communities where there's so many people, willing to give volunteer time and energy to such an important issue, but one that doesn't always make the headlines. So I appreciate your willingness.
Excellent. Thank you for being here with us this evening. Abigail, do you have any closing thoughts you want to toss on?
Thank you. No, but thank you. And I feel engaged and ready to get on the next committee.
Yeah. A few sessions ago, I said, I need a sermon. I need something to fire me up. Thank you, Lee, for giving us that sermon. Cool. Well, with that, as I will probably hit you up and have some conversations about the other bits of this later, but I want to make sure everybody feels comfortable calling it an evening. We will post the video probably by Friday. It takes me a few hours of processing and stuff to get this up on the Petaluma Urban Chat website at urbanchat.org. And unless anybody has any further closing thoughts, thank you very, very much. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to meet you all. Hope to see you in person one day.
Yes.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you very much.
Good night, all.
Appreciate the invite. Thank you, Dave and Dan.